When I finally opened my eyes after 3 months in a coma, the first thing the nurse said was, "Your family already handled your finances." She said it softly, like it was good news, like I was supposed to feel relieved. I lay there blinking at the ceiling with machines still beeping around me and tubes coming out of my arm, and I thought, okay, at least somebody took care of things while I was gone. Then she handed me my phone. I opened my bank app out of habit, the muscle memory of a man who had spent 15 years building something careful and steady. The screen loaded. I stared at the balance for a long moment, waiting for my brain to catch up with what my eyes were reading. $4.12. The account that had held $486,000, savings built over 15 years of working double shifts, skipping vacations, and saying no to things I wanted so I could say yes to my future, had been wiped down to nothing. Every cent. Gone. And every single transaction had happened while I was unconscious in that hospital bed. My name is Derek. I'm 38 years old, and before the accident I was a logistics manager at a mid-sized freight company. No flashy lifestyle, just 15 years of steady work and careful saving. I had $486,000 in my account because I had never stopped treating every raise like it didn't exist and banking the difference. The hospital staff told me my family had been visiting nearly every day while I was unconscious, crying in the hallway, praying out loud, telling the nurses how much they loved me and how they just needed me to pull through. The nurses on my floor knew their faces and had comforted them. And the whole time, from the third week of my coma all the way to the final days before I woke up, my bank account was being quietly and systematically emptied. I scrolled through the withdrawal history on my phone. Every transaction had a timestamp. Every single one fell inside the window when I was unconscious in that bed. Not one of them was made by me. Not one. The bank manager came to the hospital himself when I called. He sat in the chair beside my bed with a folder in his lap and explained that someone had presented a power of attorney document at the branch approximately 2 weeks after I was admitted. The document had granted full access to my accounts, savings, checking, everything. He said the person had made several large withdrawals over the following weeks, each one just under the threshold that would have triggered an automatic fraud alert. All processed legally according to the paperwork on file. I asked to see the document, every page, every signature, every notarization detail. The manager opened his folder. Then he closed it. He looked at me with an expression that told me what he was about to say had been sitting uncomfortably with him for some time. He said the document that had been on file in the system no longer appeared accessible. It may have been archived, he said, during a routine process. He would need to submit a formal retrieval request. He also told me the name signed as authorized agent on the power of attorney. My older brother Marcus. Marcus showed up at the hospital 3 days after I woke up with a wide smile and his arms open. He hugged me longer than felt natural and said the whole family had been praying, that seeing me awake was the greatest thing that had happened to him in years. He pulled up a chair and sat close and asked how I was feeling. He was also wearing a watch I had never seen before, heavy and silver with a brand name I recognized as expensive. His shoes were new. His jacket looked fresh off a rack. When I brought up the bank account, keeping my voice flat, he nodded and said the money had gone toward my medical bills, that insurance had gaps and things had gotten complicated fast. He said it smoothly, like a man who had rehearsed it several times. I thanked him and said I understood. He left looking satisfied. That night, a nurse named Sandra came in after visiting hours and closed the door behind her. She said she had been going back and forth about telling me something since I woke up and had finally decided I had a right to know what she had heard. Sandra had been on my floor the entire 3 months I was unconscious. She stood near the foot of my bed and said my family had not just been visiting out of love. She had heard them arguing through the door more than once, voices raised, talking about amounts and percentages and whose name things should go into. She said one conversation had stood out above the rest. She had been standing just outside my room when she heard Marcus tell my mother they needed to move on the house before I showed any signs of waking up, because once I was conscious, everything would get complicated. She said my mother had agreed and her exact words were, "He's not coming back, so stop stalling." Sandra looked at me after saying that and told me she was sorry. She also said she would be willing to write down everything she remembered if I ever needed it. I told her to please write it all down right away. Then I lay back in that hospital bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about Marcus's expensive new watch and my mother's voice saying stop stalling. And I made a decision that I was going to be very patient and very careful about what came next. I called the bank the next morning and asked for a full copy of the power of attorney document Marcus had used. The manager put me on hold. When he came back, his voice was tighter and more careful. He said the document no longer appeared accessible in the system. It may have been archived, he said again. I asked him directly, was it deleted? He could not confirm that. I asked who had access to the document management system for my account. He said he would need to look into it. I asked when the last access to my file had occurred. Another pause. He said there had been some activity on the digital file earlier that week, after I had woken up, after Marcus knew I was conscious and asking questions. Somebody had reached into the bank's system and removed the paper trail before I could request it. The document wasn't misplaced. It had been deliberately taken down. Someone with system access had cleaned up behind Marcus. And that told me something important. Marcus had not done this alone. There was someone inside that bank who had helped him, and that person was still there. My college friend Tony had spent 12 years in IT security and knew how financial institutions handled their data. I called him and explained everything. He told me the most important thing to request was not the document. It was the security camera footage from the branch on the days the withdrawals were made. Every bank keeps recorded footage of teller transactions above a certain dollar amount. And that footage would show exactly who walked in and presented the power of attorney paperwork. Tony helped me draft a formal written request citing my rights as the account holder. My attorney sent it with a letter making clear I was prepared to escalate to regulators if it was not honored. The bank responded within 48 hours. Their letter said the footage from those specific dates had already been overwritten under standard retention procedures. Tony told me that was not supposed to happen. Footage tied to a large withdrawal under active review was exempt from routine overwrite. Someone had accessed the retention system and removed it ahead of schedule. The camera footage was gone before we could reach it, but Tony kept digging. Tony found something buried in the transaction records I had downloaded before the bank locked my full account access. One large withdrawal, $47,000 in a single transaction, had been processed through a branch code that did not correspond to any currently operating Valley Federal location. The branch code was real, but the physical location had been closed and consolidated into another branch 14 months earlier. Tony said that was not a clerical error. A closed branch code appearing on a live transaction meant someone with back-end system access had manually entered it, likely to create a routing gap that would complicate any audit trail. This was not Marcus working alone. Marcus was not a banker and did not have access to a financial institution's internal coding system. Someone inside that bank had processed these transactions in a way designed to make them harder to trace. Tony cross-referenced the closed branch code with staff records from a financial industry database and found that the code had last been actively used by a single employee whose login credentials had never been fully deactivated when the branch closed. That employee still worked at Valley Federal. The employee's name was Derek Holt. I ran the name through my memory and came up empty. Then I called a mutual friend and described him. The friend went quiet for a second and said, "Derek, that's Marcus's old roommate from Claflin. They were close sophomore and junior year." I sat with that information for a long moment. Marcus had a contact inside the bank, someone with legacy system access from a closed branch, someone who could process transactions through dead routing codes, someone who had the ability to pull a document from the digital system before I woke up and asked for it. Derek Holt had been the inside man. The operation had 2 people running it at minimum, and both of them had been careful. But I had not yet told Marcus that I was starting to map the full picture. He still believed I was confused, still recovering, still too foggy to put things together. That was an advantage I intended to hold onto for as long as possible, because the next step required Marcus to stay comfortable while I kept building. I called Marcus 2 days later and played it exactly the way my attorney coached me. I told him I was still having trouble with my memory, that doctors said some cognitive fog after a long coma was normal, and that details from before the accident were blurry. I said I was confused about some financial matters and just needed him to help me understand. I kept my voice tired and a little lost. Marcus relaxed almost immediately and started filling in details helpfully, confidently, the way people do when they believe they're talking to someone who cannot check their story. He talked about the medical bills and the insurance complications. Then, near the end of the call, he mentioned almost casually that the family had also been taking care of the house, that I had apparently made some arrangements before the accident about what should happen to it if anything went wrong. He said it like something settled and remembered, but I had made no such arrangements, and I knew exactly what those arrangements looked like on paper. I went online that same night and pulled up the county property records for my home address. What came back on that screen made my jaw go tight. My house was no longer in my name. The ownership had been transferred. The new owner of record was my mother, Patricia Wells. The transfer date was 6 weeks after I was admitted to the hospital. 6 weeks in, I was fully unconscious. There was no version of reality in which I had voluntarily signed anything. I pulled up the actual transfer document. It was a standard deed form with every box filled in, notarized and stamped and filed with the county clerk like any legitimate transaction. My name appeared on the grantor line as Derek A. Wells. The signature beneath it looked like mine at a quick glance, the same general shape, the same starting loop. But I had spent 15 years signing my name on freight manifests, and I knew exactly how my signature looked. What was on that document was close. But it was not right. Someone had forged my signature and had a notary certify it. I looked up the notary's name, Robert Finch, in the State Bar Association's public directory. What came back told me exactly what kind of operation I was dealing with. Finch had been disbarred 2 years earlier for document fraud. I started recording every conversation with Marcus after discovering the forged deed. I used a prepaid phone Tony had picked up for me, kept it running in my jacket pocket during visits and face down on the table during calls put on speaker. Most conversations were careful and vague, but people who feel safe get comfortable over time. About 3 weeks after I was discharged, Marcus came by my temporary apartment and we had a few drinks and he got loose and talkative. He started talking about the stress of those 3 months, everything the family had managed, how hard it had all been. Then he leaned back in his chair and said it like it was a punchline to a story only we shared. He said, "Man, you almost dying was the best thing that ever happened to us." He was still smiling when he said it. I kept my face perfectly still and said nothing, and the phone in my jacket pocket recorded every word. That was the moment I knew we had enough to start building the case in a way that would be very difficult for anyone to walk back from. The deed transfer had been notarized by an attorney named Robert Finch, a man I had never hired and had never met. I searched his name in the State Bar Association's public directory. He had been admitted to the bar 18 years ago and had been disbarred 2 years prior following a disciplinary proceeding involving document fraud and misuse of notarial authority. The bar record described his violations in plain language. A disbarred attorney no longer holds legal authority to notarize anything. Any document he stamped after his disbarment was invalid on its face. The house transfer was not just built on a forged signature. It had been certified by a man who had no certification left to give. The entire document was fraudulent from the signature line to the notary seal. I brought this to my attorney along with the property record, the timeline placing me unconscious on the date it was signed, and the bar record on Finch. My attorney spread everything across his desk, read through it carefully, and then said quietly that we were looking at multiple felonies across multiple people. He told me to be patient and methodical. We were going to need one more thing before we moved. A week after I found the Finch connection, Marcus showed up at my apartment without calling first. He was carrying takeout bags and smiling. I let him in, kept my face easy, and went to the kitchen for plates while he settled on the couch. The prepaid phone was already running on the counter behind the toaster, face down, picking up audio. We talked about ordinary things. Then Marcus began asking questions that were not quite ordinary. What the doctors had said about my long-term memory, whether I had spoken to anyone at the bank lately, whether looking into my finances was still too overwhelming. Each question was wrapped in concern but pointed at the same target. He was mapping what I knew. At one point he reached over to look at something on my main phone when I set it on the table. His eyes moved across the counter and paused on the phone behind the toaster for a fraction of a second longer than everything else. Then he looked back at me and smiled. I smiled back. But after he left, I checked the main phone on the table and found that someone had navigated into the recording app and stopped the active session while Marcus was holding it. He had moved fast and quiet, but Tony had already set up a backup. After Marcus left, I immediately pulled the audio from the prepaid phone behind the toaster and pushed a copy to Tony's isolated server. Then I got an alert 2 hours later. A remote wipe command had been sent to my personal phone storage. Tony traced it the next morning. The command had originated from a device registered in Marcus's name through a shared family account. I had forgotten to remove him from after a trip we had taken 2 years earlier. He had tried to erase everything on my phone remotely. What he did not know was that Tony had been running continuous encrypted backups to a server that no remote command could access. Every recording, every downloaded transaction record, every photograph of a document, all of it was sitting untouched in cold storage. Marcus had just made 2 critical mistakes in one evening. He had confirmed he knew there was something on my phone worth destroying, and he had done it from a device registered in his name. My attorney said when I reported it the next morning that this alone demonstrated consciousness of guilt. We now had evidence of a cover-up on top of the original crime. It was time to stop gathering and start closing. I switched tactics the next day. I called Marcus and told him I had been doing a lot of thinking and wanted to stop holding stress about the money. I said I understood the family had done what they thought was right and that holding onto anger was not helping my recovery. I used the word forgiveness twice. I could hear him relax through the phone, the tension dropping out of his voice almost audibly. 2 days later, he called back and said the family wanted to celebrate my recovery. A dinner at his house, everyone together. He said my parents were coming, that his wife was cooking, that they all just wanted to see me doing well. I said it sounded wonderful and that I would be there. What I did not mention was that I had already spoken to a private investigator named Ray Callum, who had agreed to set up in the parking lot outside Marcus's house that evening with directional audio equipment and a line of sight to the dining room window. Whatever was said at that table was going to be documented by someone Marcus did not know existed. The dinner was warm and the food was good. Marcus told stories. My mother kept touching my arm. My father refilled his glass twice. From the outside, it looked exactly like a family celebrating a recovery. Ray was in a dark sedan in the parking lot with equipment that could pick up conversation through a single-pane window at 60 feet. I was wearing a small recording device Tony had fitted into my jacket collar that transmitted directly to Ray's receiver in real time. About 40 minutes into the meal, the mood shifted slightly. My father set down his fork. He looked at me across the table with something behind his eyes that was not celebration. He said he needed to say something he had been carrying since I woke up. The table went quiet, and then my father, in a voice that sounded like a man trying to confess and justify in the same breath, said they had taken the money because they were certain I was never going to wake up. He said they had expenses, debts, and that sitting on nearly $500,000 while the family struggled felt wrong when I wasn't there to use it. He used the word practical 3 times. I kept my face still and said I was trying to understand. The table was quiet after my father finished. My mother looked at her plate. Marcus reached for his glass. I looked at him across the table and waited. He had the expression he always wore when he was deciding how much to say, weighing the room, calculating the risk. Then he said the worst part. He said it almost lightly, like a joke shared between people who had already gotten away with something. He said, "Shoot, if he slipped back into that coma tonight, nobody would even question it." Nobody laughed. Nobody told him to stop. My mother continued looking at her plate. My father took a slow sip from his glass, and Marcus sat there in his own dining room at a table celebrating my survival, having just said out loud that my death would be convenient. Ray's equipment in the parking lot captured every syllable. My in-collar device provided a backup track. My attorney listened to the full recording the following morning. He stopped the playback at that line and sat with his hands flat on the desk for a long moment. Then he said, "We have everything we need and more." It was time to move. My attorney filed the lawsuit the following morning. A civil complaint nomming Marcus Wells, Patricia Wells, Gerald Wells, Derek Holt, and Robert Finch as defendants. Charges included fraud, identity theft, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, forgery, and criminal conspiracy. A criminal referral was submitted to the district attorney's office simultaneously with copies of all supporting evidence attached. The filing was served before noon. Marcus was in a meeting at his office when the process server arrived. His assistant pulled him out and he read the first page of the complaint standing in the hallway and, according to someone present, sat down very slowly in the nearest chair. At nearly the same moment, 2 detectives from the Financial Crimes Unit arrived at Valley Federal Bank asking to speak with Derek Holt. He was escorted to a conference room. He asked for a lawyer within the first 10 minutes. By the end of the afternoon, Derek had agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for sentencing consideration. And what he told them about the origin of the scheme changed the picture in a way I had not fully anticipated when I started building this case. The investigation moved quickly once Derek Holt started cooperating. Law enforcement pulled back-end system records confirming everything Tony had identified: the closed branch code, the manual routing entries, the deleted document. They also recovered the original power of attorney from a backup server Derek had not known existed, 1 tier deeper in the system than the layer he had wiped. The document was intact: my forged signature, Marcus's name as authorized agent, and Robert Finch's invalid notary seal. Investigators pulled Derek's communication records and found a message chain between him and Marcus spanning the weeks of my coma. The messages coordinated withdrawal amounts, timing, routing methods, and the timing of the document deletion once it became clear I might actually wake up. The trail was complete and documented in their own words, but Derek's cooperation had surfaced one additional piece of information. He told investigators that Marcus had not originated the plan. He said when Marcus first reached out to him, Marcus had described it as something the family had already organized, that the logistics were the only part left to handle. Derek said Marcus had told him the whole thing had been put together by one person. That person was my mother, Patricia Wells, not a participant, the architect. Derek told investigators that my mother had identified the opportunity, sourced Robert Finch through an old contact, connected Marcus with Derek, and mapped out the withdrawal schedule to stay under fraud alert thresholds. My father had known. Marcus had executed. But the plan, the decision to treat my coma as a financial window and my possible death as a clean resolution, had come from the woman who cried in the hallway outside my room every single day. Law enforcement moved on all defendants within 72 hours of Derek's statement. Search warrants were executed at Marcus's home and at my parents' house. Financial records, phones, and computers were seized. Robert Finch was located at an address in a neighboring county and taken in for questioning. Every piece of the operation that had seemed designed to disappear without a trace was now documented, recovered, and in the hands of investigators who had the full picture. The scheme that had been built on the assumption I would never open my eyes again was being systematically dismantled from every direction at once. Once Derek's statement was filed and the criminal referral moved forward, the story reached local news within 48 hours. A reporter covering financial crime obtained the court filing and ran a piece with enough specific detail to be recognizable to anyone who knew the family. By the next morning, it had been picked up by 2 regional outlets and shared widely online. Marcus's employer placed him on administrative leave before he arrived at work. My mother's church asked her to step back from her volunteer roles pending resolution. My father's name appeared beside the word conspiracy, and his employer, a county contractor, began an internal review. Friends who had known them for decades went quiet online. The community that had heard them cry and pray over my coma now had a different picture of what those hospital visits had actually been about. The public weight of it landed on all 3 of them simultaneously, and there was nowhere left to stand that didn't have the story attached to it. Some consequences arrive through a courtroom. Some arrive through a community deciding what it now knows about you. The criminal case moved to sentencing 8 months after the initial filing. Marcus entered a guilty plea on 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Derek Holt pleaded guilty to unauthorized computer access and conspiracy. Robert Finch faced criminal charges for notarial fraud and entered a plea as well. My mother Patricia pleaded guilty to conspiracy and identity theft. My father Gerald cooperated fully with prosecutors and received a lesser charge in exchange for his testimony. At sentencing, Marcus stood before Judge Linda Carver and heard her describe the exploitation of a comatose person as one of the most calculated betrayals a court could be asked to address. She said the evidence showed not a moment of poor judgment but a sustained, coordinated scheme carried out by people who had decided my unconscious body was more useful to them than my living presence. Marcus received 36 months. The bank employee received 18 months. Finch received 2 years. My mother received 24 months suspended, with 5 years of supervised probation and full restitution obligations. Then the judge addressed the civil judgment. Judge Carver ordered full restitution of every dollar taken from my accounts, plus damages calculated at 1.5 times the stolen amount, plus all legal fees. The total came to just over $1.2 million. To satisfy the civil judgment, the court authorized the seizure of assets, including the house that had been fraudulently transferred into my mother's name, 2 vehicles Marcus had purchased during the months of my coma, and a cash account Derek Holt had maintained offshore. The house deed was corrected and returned to my name within 60 days of the ruling. The vehicles were auctioned. The offshore account was liquidated. Every dollar spent on things bought with my money was accounted for and converted back into a form the court could direct toward the judgment. My attorney called me after the asset seizure was complete and read me the final tally. Between the restitution, the damages, and the returned property, I had come out of the entire ordeal in a stronger financial position than I had been in before I fell unconscious. Caleb had once said that the truth has a way of compounding interest. Standing in my own house again, I was beginning to understand what he meant. My mother found me outside the courthouse after sentencing. She had been crying and she reached for my arm and started to explain that she had not been thinking clearly, that she loved me, that she never wanted things to go this far, that grief does strange things to people. I let her finish. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about Sandra, the nurse, writing down what she heard through the hospital door. I thought about the $4.12 on my phone screen. I thought about Marcus's voice at that dinner table saying nobody would question it. I thought about Derek Holt's fingers running through my digital records while I lay unconscious. I thought about a power of attorney signed in my name while I was not in the world to say no. And I thought about my mother standing in a hospital hallway every day with her hands clasped and her eyes red, performing grief over a son she had decided was already gone. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I just said the only thing left to say. I told her, "Y'all thought I was gone, but I heard more than you think." Then I walked to my car and drove back to my house.